On the 1st of June 2009, an Airbus A330 descended through 38,000 feet over the mid-Atlantic. Its engines ran smoothly. Its control surfaces responded to every input. Its airframe was nowhere near structural limits, and for 3.5 minutes, its pilots flew it. Nose high, wings level, perfectly intact, straight down into the ocean. 228 people died that night. Not because something broke, but because the instruments lied. The alarms screamed contradictions. And in the darkness, over an ocean with no horizon, 3 trained pilots lost the single, most fundamental reference in aviation. Which way is up? This is the story of how a perfectly airworthy machine became a coffin, and what the wreckage taught us about the gap between human instinct and machine logic. On the night of May 31, 2009, Air France Flight 447 pushed back from Rio de Janeiro's Galeão Airport bound for Paris, an 11-hour crossing over the Atlantic that crews flew every week. The Airbus A330 was less than 4 years old. Captain Marc Dubois had logged over 10,000 hours. First officers Pierre-Cédric Bonin and David Robert were experienced, current, rested. The weather briefing showed convective activity over the equator, thunderstorms along the intertropical convergence zone. But nothing the aircraft couldn't handle. 4 hours into the flight, the A330 was cruising at flight level 350, 35,000 feet, over the dark mid-Atlantic, far beyond radar coverage or radio contact with the ground. Captain Dubois left the cockpit for his scheduled rest break, handing control to the 2 first officers. Bonin took the right seat as pilot flying. Robert monitored from the left. Ahead, the weather radar painted a line of red and magenta cells, the towering cumulonimbus of the ITCZ, the equatorial storm belt where air masses collide. At 02:08 UTC, the A330 entered the edge of the weather. The ride roughened, light to moderate turbulence, nothing unusual for the ITCZ. The pilots adjusted course slightly to thread between the worst cells. The autopilot held altitude and heading. The engines hummed. Every system indicator on the overhead panel and ECAM displays showed green. It was, by every measure, a perfectly normal night over the ocean. The kind of flight where the hardest decision is whether to dim the cockpit lights or leave them bright. At 02:10 UTC, Flight 447 entered a towering wall of ice crystals, the kind of convective turbulence the intertropical convergence zone throws up without warning. Outside air temperature, -40 Celsius. The Pitot tubes, 3 slender probes jutting from the fuselage, measure airspeed by sensing ram air pressure. Ice began to form inside them. Within seconds, all 3 were blocked. The flight computers lost airspeed. They did exactly what Airbus designed them to do. They disconnected. Autopilot off, auto thrust off. Flight director off. The master warning chimed twice, a cavalry charge, and the cockpit lit red. The A330 handed itself back to the pilots. No malfunction, just a mode reversion. But in the dark over the Atlantic, with no visual horizon, the crew had 2 seconds to understand they were now hand-flying a wide-body jet at 35,000 feet. The first officer in the right seat instinctively pulled back on the side stick. A startle reflex. The nose rose. The aircraft began to climb, and slow. Airspeed was still blanked on the displays, but the angle of attack was increasing. The wings were losing lift. Somewhere in the cacophony of alarms, the stall warning sounded, then stopped, then sounded again. The Pitot tubes had begun to thaw, feeding intermittent data. The computers didn't know what to believe. Neither did the crew. But the warnings themselves were lying. Because the Pitot tubes were freezing and thawing in rapid cycles, the stall alarm triggered, then silenced, then triggered again, over and over. When airspeed data disappeared, the alarm stopped. The system couldn't calculate angle of attack without velocity. When the tubes briefly thawed and speed reappeared, the alarm screamed again. The cockpit became a cacophony of contradictions. A stall warning that came and went, not because the stall was intermittent, but because the sensors were worse. The 3 airspeed indicators on the instrument panel now disagreed with each other. The captain's display showed 1 speed. The first officers showed another. The standby indicator, an independent backup system, showed a third. In the darkness, with no visual horizon, no ground reference, no way to verify what was true, the pilots had no anchor. Every instrument they'd been trained to trust was now feeding them different versions of reality, and there was no time to reconcile them. First Officer Robert, monitoring from the left seat, called out the contradictions. But his words were drowned in the noise. The stall warning was sounding. The overspeed warning joined it. The autopilot disconnect cavalry charge played twice. The altitude alert chimed. The radio altimeter called out heights that made no sense at cruise altitude. And beneath it all, the steady drone of the engines, which were running perfectly, powering a descent no one had yet recognized. But the stall warning, the loud, insistent, stall, stall, oral alert, kept cutting in and out as the Pitot tubes intermittently thawed and re-iced. When airspeed returned briefly, the warning sounded. When it vanished again, the warning stopped. Bonin heard it as a malfunction, not a diagnosis. He held the side stick back, keeping the nose high, and the A330, wings level, engines at climb thrust. Descended through 37,000 feet at nearly 10,000 feet per minute. Still flyable. No Tsukagemoto. Still waiting for someone to push the nose down. Robert, in the left seat, saw the altimeter unwinding and called out the descent, but neither pilot verbalized the word stall, and neither recognized that the solution was counterintuitive. Push forward, lower the nose, trade altitude for airspeed. 2 minutes into the emergency, Captain Dubois re-entered the cockpit, but by then the aircraft had fallen through 20,000 feet. He asked what they were doing. No one had an answer. The vertical speed indicator showed them dropping at nearly 12,000 feet per minute. At 02:14:28 UTC, 3 minutes and 22 seconds after the autopilot disconnected, the A330 struck the Atlantic surface at over 100 knots, nose high, wings level, in a deep stall. The impact was not survivable. The fuselage shattered on contact. In the final seconds, Robert had finally understood and called out, "Climb, climb, climb." But Bonin's side stick was still full back, and the two inputs cancelled each other in the Airbus's control law. The ocean had no horizon to offer, the instruments had no consensus to give, and the crew never recognised what the airplane was trying to tell them. But here's what the wreckage revealed, and what makes this crash so haunting. When investigators recovered the flight recorders from 2.5 miles down, the data told a story no one expected. Throughout the entire descent, from 38,000 feet to impact, the Airbus never exceeded a single structural limit. The wings generated lift, the engines delivered thrust, the flight controls responded to every input the pilots gave them. The aircraft was in a deep stall, nose high, airspeed below minimum, sinking at 10,000 feet per minute. But it was flyable. A simple push forward on the side stick would have lowered the nose, accelerated the wings back into clean airflow, and restored normal flight. The A330 was waiting to be flown, but in the darkness, with alarms blaring and airspeed indications still unreliable, neither pilot recognised what was happening. Bonin held the stick back. The stall continued. At 02:14 and 10 seconds, Robert finally understood. His voice on the cockpit recorder is quiet, almost disbelieving. But by then the ocean was seconds away, and there was no altitude left to recover. The aircraft that could have climbed back to cruise instead struck the Atlantic at over 100 knots, nose high, wings stalled, every system still running. It had never stopped being flyable. The problem was no simulator in the world had prepared them for this. High-altitude stall recovery, the very manoeuvre that could have saved Flight 447, was not part of standard airline training curricula in 2009. Simulators focused on low-altitude stalls during takeoff and landing, scenarios where the ground provided an obvious reference and recovery was instinctive. But at cruise altitude, in darkness, with no horizon, and contradictory instruments, the same stall presented entirely differently, and pilots had never practiced it. Decades of reliable automation had quietly eroded the very skills the emergency demanded. Modern airline pilots spent most of their careers monitoring computers, not hand-flying aircraft. The autopilot managed the vast majority of every flight, from climb out to final approach. When the systems disconnected over the Atlantic, Bonin and Robert were suddenly required to manually control an aircraft at an altitude, and in conditions they had almost never hand-flown. The muscle memory, the intuitive feel for pitch and power, had atrophied. Automation had made flying safer, until the moment it asked humans to take over. And no one had trained them for the startle effect, the cognitive shock that follows a sudden, unexpected emergency. Research would later show that startle can freeze decision-making for critical seconds, narrow attention to a single instrument, and trigger instinctive but incorrect responses. Bonin's nose-up input wasn't incompetence. It was a deeply human reaction to an overwhelming sensory assault in the dark. The industry had built systems assuming rational, methodical responses, but it had never accounted for the first 10 seconds of confusion when the brain is still catching up to the crisis. The aircraft vanished from radar at 02.14 UTC. For 5 days, search planes and ships scanned the surface of the Atlantic, finding only scattered debris and a slick of jet fuel. Fragments of seats, luggage, a vertical stabilizer. But no fuselage, no black boxes, no answers. The wreckage had plunged nearly 13,000 feet to the ocean floor, beyond the reach of conventional search equipment. The investigation would require technology designed for deep-sea exploration, not aviation accidents. It took 2 years, 4 search campaigns, and autonomous underwater vehicles scanning the abyssal plain before investigators located the main wreckage field in May 2011. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, designed to survive impact and pressure, were recovered intact. Forensic teams reconstructed the final 4 minutes from data points logged every second: pitch, roll, thrust, side stick position, every alarm, every call-out. The timeline they built was unambiguous. The aircraft had been flyable until the moment it struck the water. The industry's response was immediate and global. Within 18 months, aviation regulators on both sides of the Atlantic mandated high-altitude stall recovery training for all airline pilots, scenarios that had never been required in simulator curricula. The exercises were uncomfortable by design: sudden autopilot disconnections at cruise altitude, contradictory instrument readings, the counterintuitive push forward when every instinct screamed to pull back. Pilots who had flown for decades without encountering a high-altitude stall now practiced it twice a year. Airbus redesigned the Pitot tube heating systems across its fleet, and airlines accelerated the replacement schedule for older probe models vulnerable to ice crystal blockage. But the deeper change was philosophical. The industry began to reckon with automation dependency itself. New protocols required crews to practice manual flying at altitude, not just during takeoff and landing. Flight management computers were reprogrammed to provide clearer guidance during sensor failures. And cockpit resource management training, long focused on communication, now included startle effect and cognitive overload, teaching pilots to recognize when their own brains were lying to them. The final report, released in July 2012, assigned no single cause. Instead, it catalogued a chain: Pitot tube icing, crew response, training gaps, human factors, systemic blind spots. The investigators wrote that the accident resulted from the combination of, and then listed 17 contributing elements. But the conclusion was unambiguous. The crew never understood they were in a stall situation. The legacy of Flight 447 is written in every simulator session, every revised checklist, every pilot who now knows that when the instruments lie, the solution is not to fight the airplane, but to fly it. The paradox endures: a perfectly flyable aircraft flown into the ocean, not because the machine failed, but because in 3 minutes of darkness and confusion, human intuition collided with machine logic, and neither won. 228 lives were lost that night. The lessons written in their memory now live in every simulator, every checklist, every pilot who trains for the scenario AF4047 revealed. The instruments will lie again. The question is whether we'll recognize it. Quick note, this is for education only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research before investing.